Welcome to another episode of the Loadout Music Podcast, featuring in-depth interviews with a wide range of music personalities, from rock and roll Hall of Famers to Grammy winners and today's rising stars. Recorded in St. Louis, Missouri, now here's your host, Aaron Perlett of Atomic Junk Shop.
Welcome back to the Loadout Music Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Aaron Perlett. So in 2018, one of my favorite singer-songwriters with an unmistakably swampy baritone and style, that's Tony Joe White, who's best known for his 1968 song, Polka Salad Annie. He passed away after suffering a heart attack in Tennessee. Afterwards, his son and manager, Jody White, unearthed boxes of reel-to-reel tapes filled with hundreds of demos that no one has really ever heard. And what's come of that has been a terrific collection of new Tony Joe White music, with presumably more to come. And today we are joined by Jody White to talk about his dad, the legacy of the Swamp Fox, and what's coming next. Jody, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I'm happy to be here to discuss this with you.
Yeah, what's I'm always curious. I've chatted with, say, like Devin Allman before, and what's it like growing up with a dad who's got some semblance of celebrity the way your dad did, especially amongst musicians? I mean, he was kind of idolized within the music community.
Yeah, I feel like he was just as famous as he wanted to be. There was a lot of things he probably could have done differently early in his career to spend more time in LA and New York doing press and radio, and he just chose not to do those things. So to me, it was kind of interesting because, while especially when we were growing up in Memphis, he was definitely more like a local celebrity. But a lot of the times, my time growing up in the 80s, like he wasn't as well known. So people just knew my dad was a musician and whatnot. I didn't know that much. But then in the 90s, when he came back with the Tina Turner stuff and started touring again, and Roger Davies started managing, then it became a lot different because at that point I was going to college, and so he started coming in, like playing band parties at a fraternity house and stuff, and so that was really kind of what kickstarted our working relationship in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's strange. My son has never asked me to come play a gig at his fraternity house. So
yeah, so one of the other guys, like in the fraternity, was looking at this book of Rolling Stone photos from the 70s. It was like, "Is this your dad?" I was like, "Yeah." He was like, "You think he would come play a band party?" And I was like, "I'll ask him." And he was like, "Sure." So he came up, and it was so much fun. So it was like, at the University of Tennessee, like whenever we played Alabama or Florida at home, we had my dad come play, and it was just a huge party and a lot of fun. And then that even carried over after college, where we started doing these fundraisers at Christmas and getting 10 guys to host a party and inviting hundreds of people. And he would play at that as well. And that was kind of a continuation of it. It's a lot of fun. Those were some of the most fun times I think we had together. And it was just really, kind of my first time being around him in that atmosphere.
Yeah. When you listen to his music, and I've just been such a fan of his music for so many years, he has this aura about him in his music that is just, it radiates cool. And I'm curious, you always want to know, is that who he was? Like that persona that just seemed to come through his art. Was that who the guy was in real life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny you bring that up. I saw Steve Jordan yesterday just for like a quick catch up for like an hour, and he said the same thing. He's like, I've been going back and watching these videos of your dad. He was like, and he just had so much coolness the way he was playing that it almost made other people around him kind of nervous. And he's like, the perfect example is watching the video of him and Johnny Cash. He's like, you can tell Johnny Cash is as big as he was, and it being his show, he was kind of nervous trying to keep up with just the coolness of, how he looked, how he played, and just the whole persona.
Yeah. And, it also seems like through the music, he was who he was. That he was a country kid from Louisiana, and you just kind of like feel that in the lyrics, in the sounds that he created. And when you go through the catalog, it just kind of bleeds that. You can't help it.
Yeah. It's, what's really interesting, my mom and I talk about this a lot, is that he was able to like perfectly weave fiction and reality. So there was not a real person named Polk Salad Annie, but there was someone he knew who reminded was, somewhat based on. But then a lot of the things like, that Polk Salad Annie was about may or may not have been true. But you just, you don't even, you just, it's hard to tell because the way he tells these stories, they feel so real that you just don't really know like how he weaves these two together. It's like I feel like that was one of his biggest gifts.
Yeah, I mean, whether you're talking about Bubba bringing in a world-class bass, or where you're
Right.
talking Calhoun Sheriff, you know,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. I
like
mean, that's right. All of those stories are based on something, but they've all been, he's made them to be like his own sort of tale, like swamp tale in a way. Um, and I mean, even like a more extreme example is if you listen to the Dan Auerbach record, there's a song Over You, which is just, I mean, the lyrics are heartbreaking about, being married his whole life to the same person. And then this person essentially like being in the hospital and dying and all of these things, but none of it was true. It's just, but you listen to the song and you want to tear up, but in reality, it was just something that maybe someone he knew was going through, and that's how he got it out.
yeah, and it's funny that the Calhoun Sheriff always haunts me only because the ending, it's just left there. Like he's sitting eating with a guy at a kitchen table, and he's like, what the hell goes? Where does this go?
I know. I mean, that's kind of thing, you talked about Bubba Jones. It's like that whole song is built up for him to land this fish, right? And
Yeah,
then the last thing is it broke his line, and that was it. Said he'll be back to get revenge, basically.
yeah.
Like, so it just drops the ball on you at the end.
There's some guys that I'm shocked they don't get the acclaim that they are due. For example, I get infuriated every time the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame rolls around and Little Feat is passed by people who have no business being in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame if Little Feat's not. Your dad has always been one of these guys to me, it bothers me to a degree that more people aren't familiar. I mean, he wrote songs for Elvis, for Tina Turner. People, very few people outside of music circles again know that he wrote Rainy Night in Georgia. But are you ever? And I know he didn't. I remember reading a quote of yours saying that he didn't have a record deal from like 78 to 1990. And I'm thinking to myself, what the hell is wrong in this world when like Men at Work can have a record deal, but Tony Joe White doesn't have a record deal in the 80s.
Yeah, it when I go back and look at it all and talk to my mom about it, because really she's the only one that lived it all with him. She just said, a lot of that was his decision. Like, the label wanted him to move to LA or New York, and they gave him money, and he was like, nope, and bought a farm in Arkansas in the middle of nowhere. And he didn't want to tour. He didn't want to, he would tour some and put on great shows, but he wasn't just going to, run himself into the ground. Like I feel like they were kind of wanting him to, he, like you said, he came from, picking cotton in the middle of Louisiana, in the middle of nowhere, to all of a sudden he's touring all over the world and playing shows in London and Paris and on the road with CCR. And I just think, he couldn't do that 365. He had to turn it off for a while. And I think in that maybe Monument was like, well, if he's not going to be doing that, then we can't really promote it. And so I think that's why things sort of cooled off with him. And then also it was just the sound of the time. Like, the late 70s, they were going into disco and whatnot. And he just was, didn't really fit in anywhere. But the thing was, he kept making music during all that time. And so that's the stuff that I'm starting to roll out. So, we hear some things that are more traditional Tony Joe White, but like, we just put out this song, these London DJs called the Flying Mojito Brothers. And the song is called About to Dance in My Pants. And it is just ridiculous because, again, he didn't have a label telling him what he could and could not do. So he was at his home studio just making like absolutely ridiculous songs with drum machines and synthesizers. And just, it was still within the sound of that time, but he just didn't have a record deal.
Yeah, when I first heard that song, it reminded me of the old there was a Dr. Hook song of a very similar name. I want to get up and dance my pants or something like that. So yeah, let's talk about
There's
this.
more of that. I'll just, we've got more of
think
that kind of stuff in addition to, I mean, everything from things he did just before he passed away back to things he did in the like mid 60s before Polk Salad Annie, before Rainy Night in Georgia, like when he was living in Texas and just went and bought, my mom said it was a Curtis Mathis 4-track because he wanted to hear how he sounded. And so he would sit up on the back porch and play songs on that. And we have those tapes still. I mean, it's incredible.
So your dad passes in 2018. At some point you get into some of these storage facilities and you find the stuff and you reach out to Dan Auerbach, and who was kind of like, hell yeah, I want to, like let's do this thing. Right? Talk about that experience because it's a really good record if you haven't heard it, that Dan produced, and talk a little bit about that whole experience.
It was really wild because almost all of those songs were just on 3 reel-to-reels, right? It was like 3 different sessions of songs, and none of them had been released. And I was just kind of thinking, like, what should we do with this? Like, and because these songs, again, like stylistically, they were all over the place. It wasn't like, oh, these songs are all bluesy, they'll be perfect to make this kind of record. The songs were all so different. And so I sent those to Dan. There were like 12 or 13 songs, and he was like, hell yeah, like 9 or 10 of them. He was like, these are awesome. I want to do these. And so that's how it happened. And it moved so quickly. Like when Dan gets involved with something, like he's not screwing around. He wants to get it done. He wants to release it. He wants to promote it the right way and get it to the people, and I think that was very evident there. I mean, it went from an idea to a record in just a few months.
Now, how did you have I assume you had a pre-existing relationship with Dan. How did that come about, your relationship?
So Dan and I have known each other a long time. We have a mutual friend from Australia, a guy named Brian Taranto, is a tour promoter. And my dad was the first person he ever brought over to tour. And so he later brought over the Black Keys to tour. And so then he introduced me to the Black Keys. And I had worked with Dan and with Pat on some other projects as well. But, the whole reason he and I were introduced was to do a Tony Joe record. And it was hard to get it to happen while he was alive because like he just kind of wanted to record at his studio with his musicians. And he just wasn't a very patient person in terms of like, he didn't want to go spend all day in the studio working on snare sounds, right? Like he just wanted to bring in his guys. Usually they had never even heard the song. He would play it for them one time and they might, if he had a bass player for that session or a keyboard player, they would chart out what they thought he was going to do. And then he would just play it until he felt good about the take. And he was like, oh, that was it. Let's go back and listen. And then when we went back and listened, he was like, cool, let's move to the next song. And so then he might go back and add some guitars, or we might add some strings or horns or whatever after the fact. But like, he was not a patient person in terms of like being in the studio and getting it down, you know. But that's why this ended up working out, because, you know, we had these high quality audio recordings that had never been released. And Dan's studio is, you know, one of the best in the world, in my opinion. And, you know, it was just a great fit.
And it seems like with the evolution of Dan's style, because when the Black Keys started, you know, they were very much like a heavy blues rock. And you've seen Dan progress and become more poppy as he's kind of his musical style and journey has evolved. And because of that dichotomy of these different types of songs you were talking about with your dad that you found, it seems like Dan then becomes almost an ideal production partner on this because he's got a pretty wide.
Oh, he's amazing in that sense. And he, you know, not only like has the creative ideas, but he also knows the people. So for instance, Bubba Jones, he's like, we have to have Marcus King playing on this. And so he gets Marcus King to come in. And then um down by the border, wait, was it down by the border? No, sorry. What was the, I have the CD right here.
I know you had Stuart Duncan and
It was
Flynn and Bobby Wood.
yeah, I mean, you know, all these guys, but like on the song Del Rio, You're Making Me Cry, like he knew all of these people he wanted to bring in. So he brings in somebody different on every single song based on what he's hearing and what he thinks and what he knows about people's sound. And he's just like a genius in terms of like being able to have that vision and connect those dots.
Yeah, yeah. And so that was, I think, 2021. And then this year, you know, you mentioned the Flying Mojito Brothers song, which is kind of a funky dance number about dance. And then there's been Living on the Land. And then I loved Panther Ridge.
Yeah.
Panther Ridge was the one that came out. I'm like, it felt like this classic rendition, like your father's classic sound. There was a very chill version, but it just seemed so much like at a mature state in his life too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so all of those songs, or not all those songs, the Mojito Brothers is totally separate.
Yeah.
But Living Off the Land, Panther Ridge, they're both going to be on the album coming on November 1st, which is Feeling Snaky. So Feeling Snaky is, so it's not just a remixed album, because when I was first started working with him in 2000, we recorded this, and it was called, the album was just called Snaky. But at that point in time, there was no Pro Tools. I mean, it was just a very like prehistoric setup we had. So we just I was like, well, we got to put out some CDs, Dad. So he's like, okay. So literally, like, his nephew came to our studio and we mixed it from the reel to reel straight to a DAT, and that's what we made our master from. And so the sound quality was just not very good. So when it became time to start releasing some of his past albums digitally, I held that one back. I just said, you know what, like, we need, it's same thing with The Beginning. We remixed that and put it out through New West. But this was even, I think, much more of a change, because we re-edited everything. So the guitar editing is such a big part of his music with these sessions that he's done at you know, at his studio that was in Franklin, because he would go in and put 5 guitars in, right? Well, each guitar is supposed to be in a different section. But if you're not able to like slow things down with, you know, Pro Tools and being able to visually see what they're doing, you don't know which one he wants to be up and down. So this record sonically, I think, is just maybe the best thing that we've put out from you know, our own recordings.
So has this become kind of your full-time thing, because you've got all these tapes to go through and material?
Yeah, I mean,
so
it is
the next coming years.
I mean, yeah, like, I mean, I plan on just to keep putting out new music every month, like even if it's just one song. But so, yeah, we'll have some more Mojito Brothers stuff coming next year, I think. The full Feeling Snaky album, November 1st, which it's a couple of the songs, you know, are like you said, Panther Ridge, they're already up. Living Off the Land. It's already up. And then beginning next year, we'll start putting out more stuff. And, just the way things are set up now, it's just much more beneficial to put out a new song every month digitally. And it just sort of feeds the beast in terms of the streaming world. And I think it keeps people happy. You don't ever want to oversaturate the market with releases. But at the same time, you put out a new song and someone listens to that song. And while they're listening to that, they go and listen to 2 other albums. Like, that benefits your numbers, that benefits your streaming numbers, and you're just feeding into that algorithm. And at the end of the day, you're giving the fans more music.
Yeah.
It's like, why sit on it forever,
Well, let me ask you this, from an emotional standpoint, is this a nice way for you to be able to kind of honor your dad?
100%. I mean, because I managed him for 18 years while he was alive. So that was, it was already my passion and my full-time job. But then once, everything happened, it really, because then it's like, okay, well, he's not really continuing his own legacy now. Like, someone's got to step in and make sure people are paying attention. So it's great. He's being inducted to the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame on November 6th. So, I just think this is we're about to just see like a big resurgence, and we've got so many interesting projects in the works, and some music I think that's going to be very, very well accepted, and just more people learning about who he is every day.
Yeah, it allows you to kind of serve as a gateway to introduce your dad to a lot of folks that maybe had never heard of him, or at least understood, to me, the breadth of his legacy, because his legacy is so much bigger than I think most people recognize about your dad.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the work that we're going to do in the coming years is going to bring more attention to that as well. We've got Steve Jordan is working on an album right now. The last songs my dad ever wrote, like, they were working on this album when he passed away. And so we had to go back and look and say, okay, well, we have these recordings that were supposed to be the demos, but now those are the ones we have to build around. So I don't want to give away too much of the excitement about that album, but it's going to be really, really special.
All right. I'm going to let you get out of here on this question.
All right.
How do I get the belt with the snake head on it? The snakeskin belt with the head. How do I get that?
The strap.
Yeah, the strap.
The guitar strap.
How do I get? I got that. Come on, man. We got to make that happen.
I do have it.
That's how you knew your old man meant business. It wasn't just a snakeskin guitar strap. It had the head still on it.
So that's right. It had the head on it, and like the fangs got knocked out. And when he went through customs one time in Australia, they were not happy about it, and they knocked the fangs out. So he had them replaced with gold fangs. And it looked even cooler. But then the gold fangs fell out. So maybe I'll need to get those replaced.
Yeah. All right. Jody White, thank you so much for coming on today, talking about your father, Tony Joe White. I guess to find anything more, streaming services, TonyJoeWhite.com. Anywhere else we're not hitting?
Nope, it's everywhere.
Thank you so much for being on the Loadout Music Podcast today.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Loadout Music Podcast, hosted by Atomic Junkshot frontman Aaron Perlett. Find all of our episodes and more at loadoutmusic.com.